Hello, everyone. Today, I'll be presenting our method for extracting information and conducting a literature review. The purpose of this method is to make the literature review process more organized, focused, and reliable. Instead of simply collecting as many papers as possible, we use several steps to search for relevant studies, filter out sources that are not useful, evaluate the quality of the literature, and finally narrow everything down to the strongest sources. The overall goal is to produce a literature review that is focused, credible, and meaningful. In the following slides, I'll explain the different methods we can use to achieve this. The first step is to search for around 20 to 30 relevant studies using Google Scholar. However, not every result we find will be useful for our topic. This is why the next step is filtering. We apply different search techniques to remove results that are irrelevant to our research. After filtering, we evaluate the remaining literature by looking at how reliable and relevant each source is. Finally, we narrow the results down to around 10 to 15 of the strongest sources. These sources can then be used for comparison in the literature review. This process helps prevent the review from becoming too broad or containing unnecessary information. The first search method is using quotation marks around keywords. Quotation marks tell Google Scholar that we want to search for the exact phrase rather than treating each word as a separate keyword. For example, if we search for machine learning without quotation marks, Google Scholar can return a very large number of results. Some of these results may discuss machine learning, but others may focus more generally on the individual words, such as machine or learning. When we type machine learning with quotation marks, Google Scholar focuses specifically on that phrase. This makes the search more precise and helps us find studies that are more directly connected to the topic we are researching. This is especially useful when our keyword consists of 2 or more words. Overall, quotation marks are a simple way of reducing unrelated results and making the search more focused from the beginning. Another useful method is combining keywords with and or. Using and makes our search more specific because the results need to contain all of the keywords we are looking for. For example, we could search for machine learning and computer vision and voice command. By combining these 3 terms, we are telling Google Scholar that we want results connected to all 3 areas. This can significantly reduce unrelated results and help us focus on studies that are closer to our actual research topic. Or works differently. Instead of narrowing the search, it gives us alternative terms to search for. This is useful when different researchers use different words to describe a similar concept. For example, we could use voice command or voice recognition. This allows us to find studies using either term. So, simply put, and helps us narrow our search, while OR helps us broaden it when we need additional results. The second method is narrowing down the publication year. When conducting a literature review, it is important to use relatively recent studies so that our research reflects current developments and allows us to make fair comparisons. For this reason, we can set Google Scholar to show results from approximately the past 5 years up to the current year. This helps us avoid relying too heavily on outdated information and allows the literature review to represent more modern research and developments in the field. However, this does not mean that every study older than 5 years should automatically be rejected. There may be older studies that are highly relevant or necessary for understanding a particular topic. In these situations, the range can be extended to around 10 years. The important point is to prioritize recent literature while still allowing older sources when they provide information that is useful and necessary for the research. The third method is checking the number of citations an article has received. The citation count can give us an indication of how widely a particular study has been used or referenced by other researchers. For example, if we are comparing several possible articles, a study with a higher number of citations may be worth investigating further because it has received more attention within academic research. This can be useful when we have a large number of possible sources and need another way to identify which ones may be worth reading in more detail. However, citation count should not be treated as the only measure of reliability. For example, a newer study may have fewer citations simply because it was published recently and has had less time to be referenced. Therefore, citations are best used as one indicator alongside other factors, such as relevance and the quality of the study. The fourth method is checking the related articles provided by Google Scholar. Sometimes we may find one article that is highly relevant to our topic, but our original search does not provide enough useful sources. In this situation, the related articles feature can help us discover additional studies that are connected to the original research. This is useful because the related articles may use different keywords or approaches, meaning they might not have appeared in our original search. For example, in the example shown on the slide, the number of available results increased from 27 to around 100 by looking at related articles. This gives us a much wider selection of potential sources to examine. However, we would still need to filter these additional results and determine which ones are actually relevant to our research. The fifth method is checking the references of relevant articles. If our initial Google Scholar search does not give us enough useful results, we can look at the reference list of an article that is already relevant to our topic. The references can lead us to additional studies that may also contain useful information for our literature review. For example, the slide shows a situation where only 17 results were found initially. However, one of the relevant papers contained 23 additional sources in its references. This shows how one useful article can lead us to many other potentially relevant studies. It is also useful because the authors of the original article have already used those references in their own research, so they can provide a starting point for finding related literature. Therefore, checking references is an effective way to expand our search when the initial number of results is insufficient. The sixth method is checking the authors of relevant articles. If we find an article that is particularly useful for our literature review, we can search for the author on Google Scholar. This is useful because researchers often publish multiple studies within the same research area. Their other publications may therefore contain information that is directly related to our project. For example, if we find one paper that closely matches our research topic, we can look at the author's other publications and see whether they have conducted additional studies that could be compared with it. This can also help us identify different approaches or findings from the same researcher. Rather than depending on one useful article, we can use the author's research history as another way of finding relevant sources. Again, these additional articles still need to be evaluated before being included in the final literature review. The seventh method is using Google Images as an alternative way of finding information. Although Google Images is not normally the main tool for conducting an academic literature review, it can sometimes be useful when Google Scholar does not provide enough information. For example, when searching for a topic such as smart homes, we can place quotation marks around our keywords and use Google Images to find relevant diagrams, articles, websites, or other sources connected to the topic. These results can sometimes lead us to additional information that we may not have discovered through our normal search. However, this method should be treated as a supplementary approach rather than a replacement for academic databases and Google Scholar. Any information discovered through this method should still be checked carefully for reliability and relevance before being used in the literature review. To conclude, an effective literature review is not only about finding a large number of papers. It is about finding the right papers and making sure that the information we use is relevant, reliable, and suitable for comparison. By using quotation marks, and or, narrowing the year range, checking citations, exploring related articles, checking references, looking at authors, and using Google Images when necessary, we can improve the way we search for literature. These methods allow us to move from a large number of search results to a smaller collection of strong and relevant sources. Ultimately, this makes the literature review more focused, credible, and meaningful. Thank you for listening.